It's an honor to announce Mrs. Saskia Bruines. She is a highly regarded alderman of our city. Yes, she is. Yes, she is. I told you. Being responsible for finance, culture and economic development. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm applause to Saskia Bruines.
Ja, dames en heren, goedenavond. Ik vind het een grote eer om hier aanwezig te zijn en dank voor de vriendelijke introductie. Thank you for the kind introduction, Peter. Dear guests, ik doe het ook in Engels, on behalf of our guest and our speaker tonight. Dear guests and dear Mr. Nadler, it's a great honor for the city of The Hague that you, Mr. Nadler, will be delivering this year's Spinoza lecture. As already said by Peter, The Hague is known worldwide as the cradle of the international rule of law. This reputation is not merely the result of the development of the past 125 years since the first Hague Peace Conference in 1899. It reaches much further back into history. Our city has long been a center of intellectual and philosophical traditions, a meeting place for political leaders and thinkers alike. And this tradition finds its most profound origins in the figure of Benedictus or Betoog de Spinoza, one of the most important thinkers in Dutch history. Spinoza is counted among other great minds such as Erasmus and Hugo de Groot, and is widely regarded as one of the founding figures of what your colleague Jonathan Israel has called the radical Enlightenment. After his exile from the Jewish community in Amsterdam and his stays in Rijnsburg and Voorburg, Spinoza settled here, in The Hague. It was here that he had his famous meeting with Leibniz, just months before his untimely death. And it was here that he completed his magnum opus, the Ethica, and began his Tractatus Politicus, which would remain unfinished. And even in 2025, we can still follow his footsteps. Both his house on the Paviljoensgracht and here in the Nieuwe Kerk, where he is buried, are open to visitors. But what truly makes The Hague the city of Spinoza is, of course, his philosophy. His ideas remain strikingly relevant more than 3.5 centuries later. His advocacy of tolerance, critical thinking, and dialogue serves as a strong antidote to the rising tides of polarization, of disinformation, and identity-based conflict. In recent years, several initiatives have emerged in our city to bring more attention to Spinoza's legacy. Notable examples include the annual Spinoza Month, this month, thanks to and compliments to the foundation, and this month which invites people of all ages to reflect and engage the dialogue. Our city council also adopted a motion that was told to encourage the linking of Spinoza's name to cultural and tourism-related initiatives. And the municipality wholeheartedly supports these efforts. Where possible, we aim to strengthen the connections between these projects. We are currently exploring the idea of Spinoza-themed year in 2027 to reflect on his legacy. And we also want to see how Spinoza's legacy can play a role in how we reflect as a city and as a society and navigate the intersection of his ideas with today's global challenges. There are great potential in making better use of Spinoza's profile as a founding thinker of peace and justice. One possibility under consideration is to give his former residence on the Paviljoensgracht a public function, as part of a broader urban development in that area. And by strengthening the philosophical heart of our city, we can introduce residents, students, and international visitors, and also national visitors, to Spinoza's unifying power, the foundation of a fair and peaceful society. For Spinoza, the ultimate goal of the state was freedom, and I quote, "To free men from fear so that they may live in all possible security, that is, so that they may preserve, as far as possible, their natural right to exist and to act without harm to themselves or to others." And this freedom from fear, together with freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from want, forms the four freedoms later articulated by President Roosevelt, the basis for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are part of our DNA as a city, the city, international city of peace and justice. A life without fear, in peace and in freedom. The great philosopher of the Paviljoensgracht showed us this vision more than 3 centuries ago, as he laid the foundation for the enduring bond between The Hague and Spinoza. Thank you.
Thank you, Wiep. After an introduction like that, anything I say now can only be disappointing. Nobody at home will possibly believe me that several hundred people have come out to hear Spinoza. So if you don't mind, all right, now we can begin. My wife is skeptical. Geachte dames en heren, friends and colleagues, it is a great honor to have been invited to give this lecture during the Hague Spinoza Month. I hope I shall do the occasion proud, though given the state of the world these days, what we really need is a Spinoza decade to help clean up the mess. A little more than 10 years ago, I gave the Gouden Eeuw lezing at the University of Amsterdam. My theme on that occasion, as today, was Spinoza and toleration. And I thought that this event in The Hague would be a good opportunity to say more on that topic, both in light of my ever-evolving reading of Spinoza and in response to more recent events. Toleration of differences in politics, gender, religion, national origin, language, even the most basic toleration of ideas is in grave danger, especially in the United States, but also in Europe and elsewhere. I hope I can get back into the country after tonight. We would do well, I submit, to heed Spinoza's recommendations and warnings, and this is what I want to remind you of today. Before I begin, I would like to stipulate something about the meaning of toleration. It's important to remember that toleration does not mean just forbearance or non-interference with other people and their views. True toleration is not merely reluctantly and grudgingly allowing people to do or to think as they please. Rather, it involves a greater, more positive set of responsibilities. Toleration means fully acknowledging and protecting the right of others to be and to think differently. And this, in turn, demands creating and sustaining the conditions for diversity in and respect for thought, action, and way of life, no matter if we disagree with or are disturbed or even offended by what others do or say. Of course, it goes without saying, however, that we should only tolerate those thoughts and actions that do not bring harm to others or even directly encourage it. That, I submit, is the true meaning of toleration. I will approach the issue of toleration in Spinoza's philosophy from 2 perspectives this evening. First, I'm going to examine a common conception about Spinoza's views on the relationship between religion and the state, and show why it is a misconception, and that Spinoza is not, in fact, who he is very often taken to be, on the question of church-state relations. Second, I would like to argue that Spinoza, despite his well-deserved reputation for being a strong defender of toleration in general, does not go as far as one might think. Indeed, Spinoza makes a potentially troublesome concession to the legitimacy of state censorship. When I say he does not go as far as one might think, I mean not only with respect to our own contemporary ideals of toleration, but also and especially with respect to his own standards, standards that were indeed exceedingly liberal for his time, but that, as I shall suggest, he might not have stood by with sufficient consistency. Let's hope I can do this right. Yes. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." This complex and oft-debated proposition, comprised of both an establishment clause and a free exercise clause, is often taken to be a clear and paradigmatic statement of the doctrine of separation of church and state. As Thomas Jefferson puts it, the First Amendment should be seen as, quote, building a wall of separation between church and state. The government may neither contribute to the promotion of any religious worship, but neither may it prevent people from observing any religious rites or ceremonies, at least so long as those activities are carried out in a peaceful manner. 200 years earlier, freedom of religion was enshrined among the founding tenets of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht states that every individual should remain free in his religion and no man should be molested or questioned on the subject of divine worship. The leaders of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century may not have always been faithful to this principle, and they certainly did not believe in the separation of church and state in the Republic, where the Reformed Church was, if not the established church, at least a formally privileged one. Still, there was for the period an unusually high freedom of religion in Holland and the other provinces. As the author of a theological political work, and having prepared the ground in his discussion of prophecy, faith, scripture, and political theory, Spinoza must finally address in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus what he views as the proper relationship between state and religion. And it is often assumed that he was a strong early proponent of the separation of church and state, and that he, along with the English philosopher John Locke, laid the foundation for future religious toleration. One recent commentator, echoing what many others have claimed, even writes that, quote, the spirit of Spinoza lives on in the opening words of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the phrase referred to as the Establishment Clause. When I assume that divine voice, that means I'm quoting somebody else. In fact, this is a very misleading characterization of Spinoza's view. The separation of church and state can mean a number of things. Spinoza did believe that when it comes to religious belief, people should be left alone to believe or not believe whatever they want. It is impossible to control people's beliefs anyway, and there's no way to monitor what goes on in their minds. True piety, the inward worship of God, is an entirely personal matter. It should, as a matter not only of necessity, but a matter of right, be left to the individual alone. As we shall see, Spinoza also argues that the free expression of one's religious beliefs, whether verbally or in writing, should be tolerated by the state. No one should be prosecuted for heresy or irreligion. However, If the separation of church and state means what it is usually taken to mean in the First Amendment of the American Constitution, that government may not regulate or formally endorse any particular set of religious practices or outward forms of belief and worship, well, then here the founders of the American Republic have parted company with Spinoza in what perhaps might seem like a more tolerant and liberal direction. According to Spinoza, in the properly ordered state, the sovereign power is charged with all matters of well-being, public well-being. Any actions or practices that enter into the public sphere and therefore may possibly affect the welfare of the people and the state, these are the responsibility of the government. The state's laws and decrees must be directed toward peace, security, and the stability of the polity, and legislatures must take care to regulate institutions whose activities have some bearing on these. By contrast, anything that is not related to the public good, such as private belief, is not within the government's purview. It follows then that the sovereign's power extends not only to the promulgation of civil laws, but to laying down religious laws as well, at least insofar as these are related to piety in the form of public activities. The inner worship of God and the feelings of love towards one's neighbors, which for Spinoza constitute true religion, these are to be left to the individual. But the outer form in which this worship and love are to be practiced, that is, the rites and ceremonies observed, the buildings in which worship is practiced, and especially the expression of obedience to God and love of one's neighbor through justice and loving kindness in action, all of this falls within the public domain and thus within the sovereign or the government's sphere of authority. This means that for Spinoza, the sovereign is responsible for what he calls the interpretation of religion. Individual citizens are, of course, free to read and interpret the Bible for themselves and to discover its exhortations to justice and loving kindness. They are at liberty to do this however they can and with whatever metaphysical, theological, or historical beliefs may help them towards obedience to divine law. But in a democracy, Spinoza's preferred form of government, the governing assembly is to decide how God's law is to be translated into practice, since that assembly has sole authority to decide what activities are consistent with the public welfare. It's important to note that Spinoza says that the organization and control of religion is the duty of the sovereign alone. Among those private citizens who are not qualified or authorized to make judgments about the public good and thus dictate outward forms of worship are the clergy. Spinoza has fully removed supervision of public religious observance from sectarian leaders and put it firmly in the hands of the civil authority. The sovereign, that is the government, is free to appoint ecclesiastics to act as ministers in religious affairs, but these representatives serve at the pleasure of and are fully subordinate to the secular authority. Civil control of religious affairs, while no doubt offensive to early modern ecclesiastics, was in fact a prominent theme in early modern Dutch Republican thought, and Spinoza was not alone in his views on this matter. The great jurist Hugo Grotius had proposed secular regulation of preaching and worship, while the political theorist Pierre de la Corte, foreshadowing Spinoza, insisted that the state, insofar as it is responsible for peace, security, and prosperity, should have power over all religious activities, while at the same time tolerating a diversity of religious beliefs. Meanwhile, the Englishman Thomas Hobbes, also unsurprisingly, argued that the sovereign is to have absolute control over religion within its dominion, not just the organization and content of public preaching, but even in determining what is Scripture and what is the Word of God. For Hobbes, there may be many pastors in the state, but they must all be subordinate to the chief pastor, namely the civil sovereign. The alternative to this consolidation of the right, politic, and ecclesiastic is, Hobbes believed, civil troubles, divisions, and calamities of the nation. For Spinoza, then, in the ideal state, there is to be one and only one form of public devotion, and it is to be determined and supervised by the civil government. Now, those who would claim that Spinoza was indeed a defender of the separation of church and state might argue that, in fact, what Spinoza is insisting upon is something weaker than what I have just suggested. Not a single form of public worship, but only the idea that all forms of public worship, and there may be many, must nonetheless be consistent with the civil laws and public welfare, as these are determined by the sovereign. Thus, he says at one point, no one can obey God unless his practice of piety conforms with the public good. So rather than being the establisher of religion, maybe the government would thereby only be its watchdog. But it seems to me that Spinoza does in fact intend the stronger claim that there is to be only one form of public worship. After all, immediately after that first sentence, he says, it is the duty of the sovereign alone to decide what form piety towards one's neighbors should take. Spinoza's intention is certainly not to institute a state religion with compulsory religious observance. And he especially does not want the sovereign to dictate religious dogma. No one is to be forced to believe or to worship anything, to join any gathering, or to engage in any ceremonial practices. This kind of enforced piety and mandated uniformity would not be consistent with the primary aim of the state or of Spinoza's project, that is, increasing the rationality and the freedom of its citizens and ensuring civil peace. Spinoza is not interested in seeing totalitarian control over people's lives. Rather, his position is based on the fear that without such singular and secular control over religious matters, there's a real danger to the well-being of the commonwealth. In Spinoza's view, ancient, biblical, and contemporary Dutch events have shown that the greatest threat to civil peace are the divisions introduced into society by sectarian religions. The multiplication of sects, even the existence of one sect, distinct from the official public one, will ultimately undermine even a powerful and prosperous society. Sectarian religions set citizens apart and against each other. Christians against Jews and Muslims, Protestants against Catholics, Protestants against Protestants, Jews against Jews. And more importantly, sectarian religions set citizens against the state itself. Because as soon as there are alternative sources of authority besides the sovereign, for example, a pope, the loyalty of citizens is divided. There are now states within the state. It becomes a legitimate question as to whether the citizens are devoted to the polity at large and to the general welfare, or to their more narrow sectarian causes. And a commonwealth within which there is such a division of loyalties, with piety opposed to patriotism, cannot last long. It will eventually disintegrate under the pressure of civil discord. As Hobbes succinctly puts it, no man can serve two masters. Or as I prefer the words of Abraham Lincoln, a house divided against itself cannot stand. The problem becomes particularly acute when the religious functionaries themselves seek influence over not just the hearts and minds of their congregations, but the social and moral lives of citizens. It is, in fact, inevitable that ecclesiastics, once allowed their independent sectarian domains, will encroach upon the civil power and strive for supremacy over it. The result of such a usurpation of political authority is a division of a sovereignty in the Commonwealth and, in the end, its downfall. Thus, for Spinoza, in the model state, there is to be only one established religion, and it will be overseen by the sovereign. In the political treatise, Spinoza does allow that there can be independent congregations of worship. However, there will be restrictions. Large congregations should be forbidden. And so while those who are attached to another religion besides the state religion are allowed to build as many churches as they wish, they're to be small, of some fixed dimensions, and some distance apart. I guess the fear is that they'll start talking to each other. The houses of worship of the national religion, by contrast, should be large and costly. So much for freedom of religion and freedom from religion. Let me turn now to the more general question of toleration. Spinoza is, without question, one of history's most eloquent proponents of a secular democratic society, and the strongest advocate for freedom and toleration in the early modern period. After all, the ultimate goal of the theological political treatise is enshrined in both the book's subtitle and in the argument of its final chapter, to show that the freedom of philosophizing not only can be granted without detriment to public peace and piety and to the right of the sovereign, but also it must be granted if these are to be preserved. I'm sorry, I'm reading from a different translation, but it's the same text you have up there. To begin with, there is the question of the toleration of beliefs. And what we've already seen Spinoza say about the freedom of religious beliefs holds for all opinions whatsoever. They are to be absolutely free and unimpeded, both by right and in fact. He says it is impossible for the mind to be completely under another's control, for no one is able to transfer to another his natural right or faculty to reason freely and to form his own judgment on any matters whatsoever, nor can he be compelled to do so. Indeed, any effort by the sovereign to rule over the beliefs and opinions of citizens can only backfire, as it will ultimately serve to undermine the sovereign's own authority. In a passage that strikes the reader as both obviously right and extraordinarily bold for its time, Spinoza writes that a government that attempts to control men's minds is regarded as tyrannical, and a sovereign is thought to wrong his subjects and infringe their right when he seeks to prescribe for every man what he should accept as true and reject as false, and what are the beliefs that will inspire him with devotion to God. All these are matters belonging to individual right, which no man can surrender, even if he should so wish. A sovereign is certainly free to try and limit what people think, but the result of such a foolhardy policy would be only to create resentment and opposition to its rule. The freedom of opinion for Spinoza is an inalienable right. Still, the toleration of belief is easy because it's necessary. Even Hobbes, no liberal, even Hobbes saw that citizens cannot be forced to believe anything. I actually think that may not be right. The pernicious influence of social media and the ways in which government can exercise control over public media suggests that, in fact, it may be easier than we fear to get citizens to believe what they want. The more difficult case, the true test of a philosopher's commitment to toleration, concerns the liberty of citizens to express those beliefs, either in speech or in writing. And here, Spinoza goes further than anyone else in the 17th century. He insists that utter failure will attend any attempt in a commonwealth to force men to speak only as prescribed by the sovereign, despite their different and opposing opinions. The most tyrannical government will be one where the individual is denied the freedom to express and to communicate to others what he thinks, and a moderate government is one where this freedom is granted to every man. Spinoza's argument for freedom of expression is based both on the right or power of citizens to speak as they desire, as well as on the fact that, as in the case of belief per se, it would be self-defeating for a sovereign to try to restrain the freedom of expression. No matter what laws are enacted against speech and other means of expression, citizens will continue to say what they believe because they can. Only now they will do so in secret. And the result of the suppression of freedom is once again resentment and a weakening of the bonds that unite subjects to sovereign. In Spinoza's view, intolerant laws lead ultimately to anger, revenge, and sedition. The attempt to enforce them, he notes, is a great danger to the state. Spinoza also argues for the freedom of expression on utilitarian grounds. It is necessary for progress in the discovery of truth and the spread of creativity. Without an open marketplace of ideas, science, philosophy, and other disciplines are stifled in their development to the technological, economic, and even aesthetic detriment of society. In this respect, Spinoza's defense of liberty foreshadows the one that John Stuart Mill would offer 2 centuries later. As Spinoza puts it, this freedom of expressing one's ideas is of the first importance in fostering the sciences and the arts, for it is only those whose judgment is free and unbiased who can attain success in these fields. For Spinoza, then, there is to be no criminalization of ideas in the well-ordered state. Libertas philosophandi, the freedom of philosophizing, must be upheld for the sake of a healthy, secure, and peaceful commonwealth, and material and intellectual progress. He asks, what greater misfortune can be imagined for a state than that honorable men should be exiled as miscreants because their opinions are at variance with authority and they cannot disguise the fact? What can be more calamitous than that men should be regarded as enemies and put to death, not for any crime or misdeed, but for being of independent mind? I think it's interesting to remember that when Spinoza is writing this, his very good friend just died in prison, and he was put in prison because he had published a book with very Spinozistic themes. The mistake he made was that he published it in Dutch, not Latin, and so it was widely accessible. Spinoza's views on liberty go beyond what was envisioned by another philosopher renowned for his defense of toleration, John Locke. Locke was primarily interested in a society, in the toleration within a society of a variety of religious ideas, so that individuals may enjoy the uninhibited personal communion with God in which religion consists. In his letter on toleration, written in 1685, Locke argued that no religious group, not even the state, has the right to persecute those who belong to other sects. Membership in a community of believers is voluntary, and thus no church may force to further its narrow sectarian aims. Different forms of worship and theological dissent for Locke are to be allowed, even encouraged, in the Commonwealth. However, Locke makes one significant exception to the general policy of openness for religious and secular ideas. There is to be no toleration of atheists and other forms of irreligion. Since atheists do not believe in God and thus embrace no hope for eternal reward or fear of divine punishment, they have no foundation for morality. And thus atheists cannot be trusted not to act in ways that are harmful to their fellow citizens. Locke claims that these are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are bonds of human society, can have no hold upon the atheist. Locke's refusal to grant the same freedom to atheists that he provides for believers is therefore made in political and ethical rather than religious grounds. And apparently it is not only freedom of expression that is being denied to them, but freedom of belief, since their mere presence in the state is supposed to be a threat to the state's welfare. I believe that this is an inconsistency in Locke's thought and a striking failure of toleration, one that is absent from Spinoza's account. One of the interesting debates in the 17th century is whether there's such a thing as a virtuous atheist. Some of Spinoza's harshest critics believe that that despite abhorring Spinoza's philosophy, he was an admirable and virtuous person. However, all of this brings me to my main point today, and I do have a main point to make. Spinoza, unfortunately, does not support absolute freedom of speech. He explicitly states that seditious ideas are not to be tolerated by the sovereign or the government. There is to be no protection for speech that advocates the overthrow of the government, disobedience to its laws, or harm to fellow citizens. People are free to argue for the repeal of laws that they find unreasonable and oppressive, but they must do so peacefully and through rational argument. And if their argument fails to persuade the sovereign or the government to change the law, then that must be the end of the matter. Above all, what citizens may not do is what he calls stirring up popular hatred against the sovereign or his representatives. Or in other words, Spinoza seems not to allow for civil disobedience. Absolutists about freedom of expression will be troubled by these caveats on Spinoza's part, and rightly so, I think. After all, who is to decide what kind of speech counts as seditious? May not the sovereign declare to be seditious simply those views with which it disagrees or that it finds contrary to its policies? Spinoza, presumably to allay such concerns, does offer a definition of seditious political beliefs as those that immediately have the effect of annulling the covenant. Of annulling the covenant whereby everyone has surrendered his right to act just as he thinks fit. The salient feature of such opinions is, quote, the action that is implicit therein. That is, they are more or less verbal incitements to act against the sovereign, and thus they are directly contrary to the tacit social contract of citizenship. Other beliefs, he says, in which there is no implication of action, such as the breaking of the covenant, the exaction of revenge, the indulgence of anger, and so forth, these are not seditious. But I'm afraid that this still leaves a very considerable gap for unreasonable censorship of the expression of ideas. Engaging in speech that immediately contributes toward weakening the political compact, this could be done directly by incendiary words intended to stir up civil disobedience, but it could also be done indirectly by spreading subversive beliefs about the sovereign. These might include a rumor that the sovereign's policies are treasonous, or even talking about how the sovereign's rule is illegitimate. In the United States, this kind of seditious talk could be exemplified by the so-called birther movement. That is a right-wing fringe that for years insisted that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and thus does not satisfy one of the conditions for the presidency. Or it could include claims that a certain election was stolen, despite all evidence to the contrary. Are these the kinds of things that Spinoza would say are illegal? Among the things that Spinoza says are not to be allowed is accusing a magistrate or a judge of injustice. We're seeing a lot of that these days in America. And yet, if there is any implication of action or an immediate effect of annulling the covenant in such cases, it's at best very obscure. And I should note here that the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled time and again that speech that merely advocates violence or even advocates the overthrow of the government is constitutionally protected. It's not clear then that Spinoza's position really amounts to the view, as Jonathan Israel for one reads it, that the expression of opinions only becomes subversive and hence liable for punishment if it directly obstructs the implementation of laws and decrees. That's Israel's reading. But it seems to me there's a very hazy boundary here between legitimate dissent and protest, which Spinoza allows is protected. A hazy boundary between that and, on the other hand, being an agitator and a rebel, which Spinoza says is not protected. Where, for example, would Spinoza place civil disobedience in the face of blatantly unjust laws? How would Spinoza handle Socrates' claim that even if the city of Athens ordered him to stop philosophizing, he would disobey the order because he owed his loyalty to a higher authority, the gods, and that his disobedience to the sovereign would be in fact to help the city remain healthy? What especially troubles me about Spinoza's loophole that allows for government suppression of ideas and speech is that it seems to resonate with the extraordinary and deeply worrisome and certainly unconstitutional steps that the current American administration is taking to police ideas and information in political, academic, scientific, journalistic, and other domains, including private communications on social media. The Trump administration is certainly not shy about loudly proclaiming its intentions. People who should, in principle, be enjoying First Amendment rights to free expression and association, including immigrants with green cards or permanent residency. They are being arrested and deported for suspicion of holding and defending views that the U.S. government deems to, quote, hamper U.S. foreign policy or are, quote, contrary to the national interest. But who determines whether advocacy hampers foreign policy or is contrary to the national interest? Well, the executive branch of the government, of course. In essence and in practice, the Trump administration is arresting and deporting people whose views it simply finds unsavory and unamenable to its own. The government has argued that the deportees do not need to have engaged in any criminal activity or explicitly subversive action. What they argue is that speech, even if made privately, is enough to justify arrest and deportation. I hope I can get back in tomorrow when I fly home. Even more troubling is the administration's efforts to determine and police not just political views, but scientific and historical truth itself. For example, in a March 27th executive order, subtitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, the President directed the Smithsonian Institution, which runs a large number of important museums, archives, and sites of commemoration around the country, ordered the institution to eliminate what it calls improper ideology from exhibits and educational programs, and to revise any commemorative or educational programs that convey, quote, a false view of history. The order proclaims that it is President Trump who will, quote, fight back to reestablish truth in the historical narrative. Truth, then, is now to be determined not by the tried and true methods of scientific and scholarly inquiry, but by political fiat and convenience. Or, in other words, what the sovereign deems to be good for the state. Meanwhile, the library of the U.S. Naval Academy has been purged of almost 400 books, with those devoted to questions of race, gender, and diversity especially targeted. Among the books allowed to remain on the shelf, Mein Kampf. This is true. I seriously doubt that Spinoza would condone such an abuse of power and intolerance towards speech and expression. And yet, might it not be permissible under Spinoza's very own principles? Spinoza's caveats about what the sovereign is allowed to censor give me pause. Spinoza may feel that he has provided an unambiguous criterion and identified a small and well-circumscribed domain for what is to count as seditious speech, and thereby perhaps maybe he has set a firewall against the arbitrary abuse of state power over the expression of ideas. But still, on his views, there appears to remain room for a clever sovereign to engage in and justify a potentially extensive suppression of ideas, including prior restraint of the press, the censorship of books, and even the prohibition of meetings. Perhaps Spinoza should have more consistently followed the logic of his own reasoning by drawing the line not within the realm of belief and ideas, including their expression, but at the border of belief and the expression of ideas on the one hand, and true action on the other hand, as he sometimes seems to do. Here's a quote from the Theological Political Treatise. "It was only the right to act as he thought fit that each man surrendered, and not his right to reason and judge. So while to act against the sovereign's decree is definitely an infringement of the sovereign's right, this is not the case with thinking, judging, and consequently with speaking too." Although, again, Spinoza adds the warning, provided one does no more than express or communicate one's opinion, defending it through rational conviction alone, not through deceit, anger, hatred, or the will to effect such changes in the state as he himself decides. Now, it might be argued that Spinoza does in fact draw the line between what the sovereign can and cannot legitimately monitor, right at the border between ideas and action, on the grounds that the expression of ideas is a kind of action. It would then be perfectly consistent with his principles of toleration for Spinoza to allow the sovereign to censor public speech and printed expression. Aren't those actions? However, Spinoza doesn't argue in that way. He does not say that the expression of ideas is an action, and therefore in the domain of the sovereign's control. Rather, he argues that those expressions that have, quote, an action that is implicit therein, that is, speech that is a call or incitement to action, these are subject to government control. And thus he maintains the distinction between ideas and their expression and action allows censorship to extend into ideas. At the same time, the boundary between thought and the boundary between thought and action gets a little blurry with the introduction of the category of the expression of ideas that, while not itself an action, implies action. What does that mean? Obviously, shouting fire in a crowded theater when there's no fire, that is in speech, that is an incitement to action. And so is properly prohibited by law. But what about speech that is a call to resist the enforcement of unconstitutional laws? Spinoza is certainly conscious of and willing to allow for some potentially unpleasant consequences entailed by the broad respect for civil liberties. There will be public disputes with freedom of expression, even factionalism, as citizens express their opposing views on political, social, moral, and religious questions. However, that's what comes with a healthy, democratic, and tolerant society. And he concedes that what cannot be prohibited must necessarily be allowed, even if harm often ensues. The proper state will be very much like 17th century Amsterdam itself, which, while not truly democratic, Spinoza greatly admired for the freedom it allows its citizens and the flourishing which such toleration has brought to the city. It is admittedly surprising to see Spinoza writing so admirably of Amsterdam, because his close friend, as I mentioned, just died in prison. On the other hand, maybe there's a little bit of bitter irony in Spinoza's words here. And yet, Amsterdam was the most liberal and tolerant city in a republic renowned in its own time for religious and political toleration. And Spinoza, while aware of the city's shortcomings, also knew well and appreciated its virtues. So let me finish by saying that we can only hope that Spinoza himself was uncomfortable with the restriction he had placed on freedom of speech, and that deep down he really was an absolutist on this matter. In the penultimate paragraph of the treatise, he does draw a clear line between ideas and their expression on the one hand and actions on the other hand, and insists that this time, without any qualification, the sovereign's authority should be restricted to the latter. He says the state can pursue no safer course than to regard piety and religion as consisting solely in the exercise of charity and just dealing, and that the right of the sovereign, both in religious and secular affairs, should be restricted to men's actions, with everyone being allowed to think what he will and to say what he thinks. This sentence, a wonderful statement of the principle of toleration, is perhaps the real lesson of the treatise and should be that for which Spinoza is remembered. Thank you.